Okay, I'm Dr. Seville, President of the World Affairs Council, and sorry for the feedback here. This is Dr. Regina Park, Chair of Great Decisions. And due to circumstances and the weather, our speaker is in DC, and he's coming to you live. He's a Google Chat or something like that. And so we're going to have a little different program today, because Q&A is also challenged. It's not like we have a mic that can speak back. So Dr. Stein has, very graciously agreed to go ahead and do a technology, sort of a brief to you about Turkey. And then we're going to break after that. And then we're going to close out Great Decisions with Dr. Aaron Karp, another Aaron, is going to talk about the future of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, with Q&A. And for Turkey questions, we also have several Turkish gentlemen here who have offered to help out. Or agreed to, I should say, since you were asked, for the Q&A session. So I think it'll be very rich, very different. Please be patient with us as we're, adapting and making this work. But I actually think you end up with a pretty interesting program. And thank you very much, Aaron, for willing to do this on the spur of the moment. I think it's a great close to Great Decisions. So I'd like to thank the Norfolk Commission on the Arts and Humanities for a generous grant and support of Great Decisions, and Dr. David Rezelman for setting up this event and hosting us at Norfolk Academy. And I'd like to thank our corporate sponsors listed in your program, Penrod, Beatty Diesel, and SunTrust. They've done great support to the community and the World Affairs Council. Also, we have upcoming events. This Thursday is going to be a program on Iran with Dr. Trita Parsi, founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. But I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Aaron Stein is a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. His research interests include U.S.-Turkey relations, Turkish foreign policy, the Syrian conflict, non-proliferation, and the Iranian nuclear program. Dr. Stein was previously a doctoral fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, an associate fellow for the Royal United Services, RUSI, and a researcher with the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. He's also worked as a consultant for the International Crisis Group in Istanbul and has published articles and reports on Turkey's nuclear capabilities and Turkish elections. Dr. Stein holds a BA in politics from the University of San Francisco and an MA in International Policy Studies from Monterey Institute of International Studies. He received his doctorate in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies at King College, London. He's proficient in Turkish and has elementary knowledge of Arabic and French. And with that, please welcome our speaker, and I'll turn it over to him.
Well, thank you for that, and my apologies for not being able to make it down there. This is actually the second time I've been invited down to that part of the world, and each time there was a weather event. So maybe, as I say, you should stop inviting me, because that could be the causal link between bad weather on the East Coast and sort of extreme weather events, but I can't be 100% sure of that. And just to warn everybody, I do have a toddler upstairs, and my wife is watching him, and he is watching TV, but I have locked this door so I don't turn into an internet sensation, like some of my other colleagues who've dialed in via Skype or electronic to give interviews. But thank you, everybody, and I'd like to start my talk with sort of a dire note by saying I don't think it's an understatement at the moment to say that, as of 10:06 a.m. As of March 3rd, 2018, the state of the U.S.-Turkish relationship is not good. In fact, I don't think it would be hyperbolic to say that this is the worst period in bilateral tensions, perhaps only rivaled by a 4-year period in the mid to late 1970s, where the U.S. Congress imposed an arms embargo on Turkey for, depending on if you are Turkish or Greek, the language, intervention, or invasion of Cyprus in 1974. And being a creature of Washington, unfortunately, I was on the Hill last week for a series of briefings with staffers and members of Congress. And I have to be quite blunt that the mood within the US bureaucracy, or at least amongst our elected representatives, about the state of the relationship is quite dark. And that the prospect, again, rivaling, or at least, bringing up that state in the late 1970s of American sanctions is very real. That there are currently a number of chats and ruminations and bills, or at least sanctions legislation, that are in the works, that are being discussed in Congress, independent of the executive, that are going on right now. And so I thought today it would be important to talk about how did we get here? How did we get to a point where two treaty allies are at the point where on one hand you have members of the US Congress, perhaps against the wishes of the executive, talking about sanctions, and on the other hand in Turkey you've had extremely heightened rhetoric against the United States, escalating at one point a couple of weeks ago, depending on who you trust for your translation, the President Recep Tayyip Erdogan threatening to bury US soldiers or to bury patches, commas, add in here, worn by US soldiers in Syria. And just a little bit of background about me is that I lived in Turkey, as my bio stated, from 2010 to the end of 2013. That was right at overlapping with the time when I was doing my doctorate in the UK. And one of the nice things about the UK is you don't actually physically have to be there to write it. So it's one of those small advantages of doing it abroad rather than here in the US. And when I lived in Turkey, and when I moved there to pay the bills, I was taking on odd sorts of jobs, and I was looking at a few Turkish research institutions. And I have to be honest, if I didn't want to be a copy editor for Turkish reports written in English to make sure that there weren't any grammatical mistakes, they all wanted me, or at least were asking me, if I was familiar with the European Union accession process. Because at that time, that was the focus of much of Turkish civil society about where Turkey was going, and at least the main thrust of their analytical and at least civil society. And as an American, I really don't know very much about how the EU works, other than the EU exists and I like visiting there. But by the time I left, by the end of 2013, all of the talk, at least within civil society and amongst the government officials that I was meeting with, had shifted from this intense focus on the accession process, on the European Union, into the Middle East. And was, at that time, the Arab Spring, and then as the Arab Spring narrowed down to what became the Syrian conflict, civil conflict. And so I think that's how I'll frame this talk, is that how did we get here really falls along two prongs. The first being Syria, the trajectory of the US-Turkish relationship in that foreign conflict. And the second, sort of the main top line or the big headline grabber, would be the failed coup attempt in July 2016. I'll start on the Syria prong because it's relatively straightforward, even if the details of the conflict involve more three-letter acronyms than my toddler can possibly ever create with his Campbell's soup. If you get beyond the three-letter acronyms and sort of zoom out to the 30,000-foot level, there are extreme disagreements between the two sides that are worth unpacking, and ultimately get back to how, as in my opening frame, about how you get to the point where you have a Turkish president making rather aggressive remarks about the US presence there. And so when I was living in Turkey around 2011, 2012, there was a lot of attention being paid to the intentions of the United States. And in particular, after both countries in the summer of 2011, building into 2012, had made the rhetorical decision to support at least the transition or the ousting of the Syrian regime. This was not an easy decision for the Turkish government. The ruling party, the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, and then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan had cultivated close relations with Syria as part of a broader Middle East strategy Trade was deepening. There was lots of tourism going back and forth between the two countries. Gaziantep, a border city, relatively large in Turkey, had a lot of Syrians that would come across and go shopping at newly built shopping malls. And so you had this deepening and interconnected relationship. And so the idea that Ankara would break with the government that it knew, problematic as it is, was a big foreign policy decision on their side. And it largely came, as a result of incremental and increased pressure by the US and the Europeans to get on board with the fast-moving train of democratization in the Middle East, and that Bashar's days were numbered. I think Ankara ultimately settled on this assessment, but this initial assessment made by both countries that Bashar was going to go no matter what we did, is where we start on the pathways to trouble. And from the outset, Turkey, when it made the decision to switch from, let's say, for support for the Syrian regime, for lack of a better word, to being in vehement opposition to the Syrian regime, is you had Ankara willing to do things that ultimately lead to a policy break with the US. And that comes in the form of two things. It's that Ankara, or at least the Turkish borderlands, became what were the back base for the initial opposition, and continuing forward was the trans-border supply of material, men, weapons, and equipment for the nascent insurgency. And what the Turks were really looking for from the United States was a commitment to, quote-unquote, be with them. And that as the Syrian civil conflict escalated and became more and more deadly, particularly from regime bombing, you had a Turkish desire for a robust US intervention aimed at establishing a no-fly zone, and even more aggressive than a no-fly zone, mimicking the US and NATO intervention in Libya just a few years earlier, where this ultimately became a support mission for the Turkish-backed opposition to overthrow the government in Damascus. And so getting back to what the focus was amongst Turkish academics and government officials at that time, all of a sudden my US passport became far more valuable because I could at least try and translate what was the thinking in the Obama administration. And to be honest, I was just reading the New York Times like everybody else because I wasn't living in Washington. And I got the distinct feeling, both as a US voter and as just reading the New York Times, is that the US was not going to intervene. And this was incongruent with the assessments that I was hearing in Ankara and Istanbul at that time. And I think one of the early divergences in the US-Turkish relationship. In addition to that, I was also had a front row seat to what we used to call, when we lived in Istanbul, it was like a return to the Wild Wild West. That border, the Turkish-Syrian border, which has long been porous, I should say, and that smuggling was a way of life for a lot of the border villages down there. That smuggling economy boomed. And not only that, the attraction of the Syrian civil conflict for a whole bunch of, lack of a better term, weirdos, around the world, became a magnet for all of these foreign fighters that were transiting Istanbul or different ways to get access to the Syrian civil war. I remember I met my first Syrian foreign fighter in the Ataturk airport in 2013, or it could have been 12, I can't remember, but it was New Year's Eve. I had just flown back from Los Angeles, where I'm from, and I was all bleary-eyed. And we were desperately trying to make it to a New Year's Eve party, and some man came up to me. He was wearing fatigues and combat boots with a loose-fitting white shirt. He had a beard a little longer than mine and long hair, and asked me in French if I knew where the domestic terminal was. Well, my bio says I am proficient in French. That's very nice. Whoever drafted that. I can order a glass of red wine. But I had no idea what to tell him other than you need to ask somebody who speaks French. But it was clear what he was doing on trips or research trips down to the border as well. Gaziantep, that same city that was an attraction to Syrian tourists, became an attraction to human smugglers and people who were ferrying people across the border. And that became a major, major problem as the United States began to seriously grapple with what became the primary focus of the U.S. intervention in Syria, which became a counterterrorism mission. And so that, that subset of problems between the U.S.-Turkish relationship began to narrow down about counterterrorism, and then you have a massive divergence about that coming, coming. And that is, as the U.S. decided to intervene militarily in the Syrian civil conflict, it didn't do so on terms that Ankara had initially proposed, the no-fly zone, sort of the Libya-style intervention, but a very narrow counterterrorism intervention that prioritized a small U.S. footprint on the ground, heavy reliance on U.S. air power, and partnering with local forces. And ultimately, the U.S. partnered with a local force that is not just hostile to Turkey, but whose parent organization has been involved in, again, depending on who you are, using terms that, that are often politicized, an insurgency or a terrorist campaign in Turkey's southeast. And so I'm talking now about the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, which was founded in 1978 but became violent in the early 1980s. And their leader is a man named Abdullah Öcalan, who, just to make the story even better, lives in an island prison in Turkey after he was captured in Kenya in 1999. And they have a Syrian affiliate called the PYD, or Democratic Union Party. The PYD has a militia called the YPG. And it was the YPG that U.S. forces grafted onto, or at least took advantage of, most notably, and for all of us watching on television, in the border town of Kobani. And it was the defense of Kobani, and what was ultimately President Obama's decision to airdrop weapons and supplies to these fighters, that you begin to see the big breakup between the U.S. and Turkey. Because if you have a narrowly circumscribed counter-terror mission on the U.S. side, which makes sense from a U.S. and Western policy perspective, because the concern is about those same foreign fighters that were crisscrossing the Turkish border. Many of them had European passports. A smaller subset had American passports, could come and go, is that you needed to do something about that. Whereas on the Turkish side, those Europeans, ISIS is a problem, and it is a terrorist problem, and ISIS did carry out a wave of very deadly terrorist attacks. But it is a co-equal problem to the YPG-PKK issue, and therefore you can't pick and choose between them. Whereas obviously, if you're a Westerner, the PKK is not a threat to your country, and so you can make compromises around how you deal with these types of groups. And so that becomes the main, wedge, or driving of the wedge, of the tensions that you see today. It's that as the YPG renamed Syrian Democratic Forces, because they have incorporated a lot of Arab groups, quite successfully actually, it's been a success of the US policy in Syria, take territory as far down as Raqqa and all the way out to the Iraqi border, and just about 15 miles west of the Euphrates River, you have a Turkish policy elite and security apparatus that is quite genuinely terrified of this US-Kurdish partnership, and has begun to take independent actions to stop it. The first was a cross-border intervention called Operation Euphrates Shield that began in August 2016. And then after that concluded more recently, which is a cross-border intervention in the northwest of Syria called Operation Olive Branch. And this is causing a lot of current tensions in the US-Turkish relationship. And I would say is the #1 focus of bureaucrats that I talk to in Washington on a fairly regular basis. It's how do you try and solve this policy impasse in a way that doesn't threaten the counterterrorism goals as described by the US, while also recognizing that in your algebraic equation, Turkey is always greater than Kurd in sort of the geostrategic geostrategic considerations of the U.S. that far outweigh just a little strip of territory against some dudes in the desert in eastern Syria and western Iraq. And this is what the Trump administration is currently dealing with. This has been a cross-administration problem. The Obama administration started this, the Trump administration instituted a review after taking power, and then the Trump administration is largely just doing what the Obama administration is doing, but in typical Washington fashion, think that they're smarter than the Obama administration people, and therefore them doing the same things that the Obama administration will lead to different outcomes. We'll see if that happens, but the overlap in policy, even between two diametrically opposed political administrations, vastly different thinking about the world, is pretty entertaining to watch as an outsider. And now I'll switch to the second prong, just to give a sense of how this plays in domestically. And this one's actually a little bit more complicated because it dives deep into Turkish domestic politics and the rise of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his party, the Justice and Development Party, or AKP. Its background, the AKP came to power in 2002. Erdogan becomes prime minister shortly thereafter. Is the first directly elected Turkish president. After he's directly elected as Turkish president, he begins a campaign to change the constitution so that it has more centralized and executive authority, definitely more autocratic in its construction. And that ultimately is a success in April 2017, where there's an up or down referendum on proposed constitutional changes. And the next elections in Turkey for what will be the first election for this executive-style presidency is scheduled for November 2019. So that's just way of background. And amid all of this politicking to get internal support for changes to the constitution for this executive presidency, right smack in the middle, you had a failed coup attempt in July 2016. And you hear, and it's perpetuated by elements of the Turkish political opposition and some elements here in the US, that this was somehow a controlled coup, or this was a false flag to try and galvanize internal support for the Turkish government. Personally, I think that's just nonsense. Well over 200 people died that night. I'm very good friends with a lot of Turks who live in both Istanbul and Ankara, and all over the place for that matter. And it was easy to watch over here when you saw a lot of bad punditry on a bunch of cable networks that night, somehow suggesting that this was a good thing. I can tell you that no Turk I talked to thought that this was a good thing. Everybody was terrified because the implications were so severe, and F-16 fighter jets making supersonic passes, breaking the sound barrier and blowing out windows. People thought that they were dropping bombs in Turkey's largest cities, which ultimately they were in Ankara. So this was a very, very real thing. And in the aftermath of this, I think you've had a shift in the psyche, or at least the operations of the Turkish government, that in a way are very easy to understand. A faction of the armed forces threatened to kill the president, the elected president, and nearly succeeded in doing so. And so if you are the president, you clearly must be concerned that this can happen again. But here's where it gets a little complicated, is that the Turkish government, or the AKP in particular, I should say, blames a man named Fethullah Gulen, who left Turkey in 1999, escaping an arrest warrant at that time, to come to the United States ostensibly for medical reasons. And he's awarded a green card in 2008. He lives in Pennsylvania. And he oversees this large network of schools and businesses, and they're very, very murky, they're very, very opaque. And they have a very large presence in the United States, particularly in the charter school field. They operate a lot of charter schools. And because of all this, they're very rich. And the AKP and followers of the Fethullah Gulen movement, or Gulenists, were political allies for much of the early AKP's tenure in politics. So 2002 through, depending on where you start to date the split, about 2011. And it was this political alliance that allowed for the AKP to really consolidate its authority within the Turkish bureaucracy. And you had an agreement between the two, where largely the Gulenists, who because of their focus on education, were moving into places of power within the bureaucracy, particularly the police and the judiciary, and as we later learned, the military, with the acquiescence and support of the AKP. And as this relationship began to fray, this becomes sort of the rumble in the jungle type fight that has begun to just completely implode and crush Turkish institutions. And the first, manifestation of this is if you were following Turkish politics in December 2013, you had a series of recordings that were placed on YouTube that implicated the ruling family, Erdogan, and members of his cabinet in mind-bogglingly high amounts of graft. Levels of corruption that, to me are still jaw-dropping. The amounts of money that they're talking about in these recordings are, at one point, they're trying to get rid of 30 million euros. 30 million euros, and this is after they've offloaded a whole bunch of cash. I don't know how big 30 million euros is sitting in cash, but it's a lot bigger than probably this room I'm sitting in. So, just to give a sense of these numbers, they're quite large. And this is where you begin to see the start of these purges, which really accelerated after the failed coup attempt. Is that in response to these leaked recordings, Erdogan begins to put extreme pressure on Gulenists in Turkey. So you had the beginning of purges in the police, the judiciary, and in their media arms. And so you begin to see a massive ramping up of the arrest of journalists and the closing down of media operations, both on television and in print, justified on the anti-terrorism spectrum and linked to followers of Fethullah Gulen. And this continues up until July 2016. And the backdrop to this is that within the armed forces in Turkey, there has been some, let's say, upheaval. Before this, in the mid to 2010-ish, into the teens range, there were two trials called Ergenekon and Balyoz, which were prosecuted by followers of the Gulen movement. That accused, more or less in both cases, that there was an internal plot amongst a faction of the armed forces to carry out attacks inside of Turkey to create a false flag type atmosphere, where the tensions would get to such a point where the military would have to be called into the streets to restore order, and the civilian government toppled. When the civilian government toppled, reorganize, and then have new elections. During the prosecution of these two trials, a lot of the officers that were accused of this basically had their promotions frozen, and new people took their place in these promotion ceremonies that happen regularly in Turkey every August. And so, as part of that crackdown I was talking about earlier that the AKP was leading after December 2013, these two trials were essentially nullified and upended, and people were reinstated. And the rumors in Turkey in late, pre-July 2016, was that these officers that had been promoted into positions of power, presumably linked to Fethullah Gulen, were going to be purged out of the military. So the telling of the story of that night in Turkey is that in anticipation of these officers being purged and trying to reorder the knights, or at least reorder the top of the Turkish armed forces, is that they took action. And that they took action to try and stop this off and to topple the Turkish government by force. That obviously failed, and then in that place, in the aftermath, starting on July 16, 2016, is that those purges that began in December 2013 rapidly accelerated, continued, and continue to this day. And so that leads you up into the current state of affairs. And then looping this back to my original point about how this drives tensions between the US and Turkey, is that Turkey would like Fethullah Gulen to be extradited from the United States for trial in Turkey. But the United States, rightly in my opinion, is holding Turkey to the same threshold that it holds every country to when it pushes for extradition, and is therefore, as best as I can understand, asking for hard, concrete linkages between Gulen and the instigators of the coup. And I think that would be difficult for any country to prove. Second, and related to this, is that within Turkey, the purges and the continued imposition of state of emergency rule, or law, excuse me, that allows the executive to rule by decree, combined with very, very credible allegations of for lack of a better word, torture in Turkish prisons, or at least in detention of suspected Gulenists, is that the extradition process is extremely difficult to carry out, because the Justice Department would have to guarantee that Fethullah Gulen would receive a fair trial in Turkey, and that this doesn't seem like it's in the cards at the moment. And so this inability to grapple with, or at least solve, these two problems, linked to the Syria thing and then to the post-coup environment, is causing a lot of tensions, particularly in Turkey, and then the government, for a lot of populist reasons that, populist and nationalist reasons as it begins to campaign for that November 2019 election. The US becomes a very easy foil. It's become the target of political parties across the spectrum. It's not just the AKP, but it's basically all, 3 out of 4 of Turkey's main parties have very disfavorable views of the United States. And you have policymakers wading into the middle of this, trying to solve it. So as I begin to conclude here, I always wish I could end presentations on a happy note. But the only happy note I can come up with is that if I am indeed correct, and maybe in the follow-on discussions that I'm not going to be there for, people will correct me or argue with this, that this is probably the worst time in US-Turkish relations. The alliance hasn't broken. There are still high-level exchanges between the two countries that happen on a regular basis. They may not be as cordial and friendly as they used to be, but friends sometimes fight. Turkey remains, within the transatlantic sphere. It's a NATO member, and despite what you would read in the press and a lot of sort of the punditry that surrounds this issue, the only people who talk seriously about kicking Turkey out of NATO, which isn't even possible, are a fringe, there's only Americans who talk about this, and on the right-hand spectrum of the American political debate. And you're not going to catch a lot of Turks in serious positions of power in government talking about this either. And within the alliance itself, within NATO, it's largely insulated from these political problems, and the two sides are able to at least talk about things that are of common cause to the alliance, like reestablishing deterrence in the Baltics against the Russians and stuff like that. And so my one happy note and my one positive note is that if we're 6 feet under, you know, and the relationship is on life support, at least it's still on life support and it's not completely, it hasn't completely imploded despite all of these tensions. But as the Trump administration really begins to, you know, settle in, and it's been a little over a year now, and well, not all government positions are filled, but as they get their feet underneath them, as any administration would, this will be a continuing foreign policy problem. So the good news for me always is that I get to give more talks about this, and we'll get to write more papers, and I can still pay the salary and the mortgage of this house. So thanks everybody, and again, sorry I wasn't down there. We had Windapalooza up here, and it's been my pleasure to speak to everybody.
Oh. I was going to call him and thank him. Are we disconnected? Oh, we're not disconnected? Okay. You can't tell I'm trying to call him.
He's like, what's going on?
This is why we're not doing question and answer like this. Can you hear me? I can hear you. Okay. All right. Well, everybody was clapping and responding very well. I know you couldn't see it. So we all really enjoyed your talk and appreciate the time that you spent with us this morning. Okay, all right, thanks. You take care. We'll talk later. All right. All right, thanks. Bye. Okay, so let's take a break and come back in 15 minutes.